Welcome to the realm of science fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Enjoy listening. James had always treasured the peaceful rhythm of his life. His home, a modest yet welcoming cottage perched on the fringes of town, delivered the solitude he sought. The evenings were tranquil, the wind biting, and the quiet absolute until this night. A firm knock jolted him from his calm. James frowned, his eyes darting to the clock hanging above the mantel. It was long past midnight. No one was due to visit. Suspicious, he crept toward the door and squinted through the peephole. His breath caught. There stood a woman, but not just any woman. Her golden hair glinted faintly under the dim porch light, her skin shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, and her sharp emerald eyes seemed to pierce the barrier between them, as though she knew he was watching. Her beauty was undeniable, yet something about her felt profoundly strange. He hesitated. His sensible side screamed to ignore this midnight caller, but an insistent spark of intrigue gnawed at him. He twisted the lock and eased the door ajar, just enough to get a clearer look. Before he could speak, she did. "Let me in," she said. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a peculiar weight. James blinked, startled. "Excuse me? You're alone. You have room. I need a place to rest." His mind whirled. Who was she? What brought her here? How did she know he lived by himself? He widened the gap, studying her more closely. A dark, rain-soaked cloak hung over her shoulders, the fabric heavy with moisture from the drizzle outside. Her lips parted slightly, her breath quick, as if she'd been running. A quiet urgency shadowed her features. "I don't usually open my door to strangers," James said, his tone guarded. "I'm not a stranger," she countered, stepping nearer. "I know you, James." A chill slithered down his back. "How do you know my name?" For a moment, she wavered, as if deciding how much to share, then let out a breath. "I've been watching you for some time, not by choice, but because I had to. I have nowhere else to turn. You're my only refuge." James exhaled, rubbing his temples. This was lunacy. Every signal warned of danger, but the desperate glint in her eyes tugged at him, making it impossible to shut her out. "All right," he muttered, reluctance heavy in his voice. "Come inside." She didn't pause, brushing past him as she entered. James locked the door behind her, watching as she peeled off her damp cloak. Beneath it, her clothing was odd form-fitting and elegant, made of a material that caught the warm glow of his living room. Her features were too perfect, almost sculpted like something unearthly. James raked a hand through his hair. "So, are you going to tell me who you are?" She lingered before replying. "My name is Elena." "And what are you, exactly?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glided to his couch and sat, crossing her legs with a grace that felt both natural and unnatural. When she finally spoke, her words came slow and deliberate. "I'm not from this place. I come from a world far beyond your grasp, where my kind exists in ways you wouldn't understand." James narrowed his eyes. "Are you saying you're an alien?" Elena nodded. "Yes." He let out a short, incredulous laugh, not from amusement, but from the sheer absurdity. "And you just happened to end up here at my house?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I was being hunted. If I hadn't left, they'd have caught me." His brief humor vanished. "Caught by who?" She turned her head, her expression darkening. "I can't tell you. Not yet." James let out a sharp breath. This was insane, completely irrational. Yet, as he stood there, staring at this mysterious, captivating woman, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was being honest. "Fine," he said at last. "You can stay here for now, but you owe me some answers." Elena gave a small, almost relieved nod. "Thank you." James scrubbed a hand over his face, already regretting his decision. "I've got a spare room. You can sleep there." She stood, but instead of heading toward it, she stepped closer to him. "I'll stay with you." James blinked. "Oh, what?" "You're my only safety. If trouble comes, I need to be near you." His heart sped up. The way she looked at him, those intense emerald eyes cutting through him, stirred something unfamiliar. He wasn't used to this kind of focus, especially not from someone so striking. "Look, Elena, I don't know how it works where you're from, But humans have boundaries. I understand boundaries, she interrupted, but I also understand survival. I have no other choice. James groaned, dragging a hand through his hair. All right, you can stay in my room. But no weird alien tricks, okay? Elena tilted her head slightly. Define weird alien tricks. He sighed heavily. Just go to bed. We'll figure this out in the morning. She nodded and trailed him down the hallway. As she settled into his bed, James couldn't shake the growing realization that his calm, solitary existence had just been shattered, and there was no undoing it. The next morning, James woke to an odd sensation, a prickling awareness of being observed. Blinking against the soft dawn light, he turned his head. Elena sat upright at the bed's edge, her piercing emerald eyes fixed on him. He flinched. Morning. She didn't blink. Your breathing changes when you rest. James rubbed his face with a groggy sigh. Yeah, that's called sleeping. It's a normal human thing. I observed it while you slept, she said plainly. He sat up, suddenly self-conscious. Wait, how long were you watching me? All night, she replied, as if it were perfectly ordinary. James groaned. That's not normal. For you, perhaps, she said, tilting her head. My kind stays vigilant in new places. Rest is less important than staying alive. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, still grappling with the bizarre reality of an alien in his home, analyzing his sleep patterns. His quiet life had plunged into the surreal. Elena rose, her movements smooth and eerily precise. I need nourishment. Great, you're hungry, James muttered, stretching. That's at least one normal thing. Let's get you some food. In the kitchen, he opened the fridge and waved at its contents. All right, what do you eat? Eggs? Bread? Fruit? Elena leaned in, inspecting the shelves as if they held some cryptic riddle. Then, to his dismay, she snatched a raw egg, shell and all, and bit into it. James lunged forward. Whoa, no. You don't eat eggs like that. She paused, half the shell still in her mouth, blinking at him. It is food. Yeah, but not like that. He carefully pried the remnants from her hands, shaking his head. Look, let me handle this. I'll make something you can actually eat. She watched silently as he cooked scrambled eggs and set them on a plate with toast. Sitting across from him, she mimicked his motions, quickly learning to use a fork. After a few bites, she said, This is satisfactory. James smirked. Glad you think so. So, what do you usually eat? She hesitated. It doesn't matter. He raised an eyebrow. I'd say it matters if you were about to chomp through a shell. She met his gaze with an unreadable stare. My kind takes in nutrients differently. We don't cook or change our food. It's not needed. James shook his head. Well, you're with a human now, so get used to eating like one. She nodded slightly. Very well. After breakfast, James watched as Elena explored the house, touching the couch's fabric, tilting her head at the TV, and flipping through a book without reading it. You really don't know much about human life, do you? He asked, arms crossed. She looked up. I've seen it. But seeing isn't the same as living it. He sighed. Okay, let's start with the basics. Lesson 1, privacy. Humans like personal space. That means no staring at me while I sleep, no grabbing food like a wild thing, and please knock before you come into a room. She nodded, as if filing the information away. Understood. Lesson 2, tech. He pointed at the television. That's a TV. It shows pictures and sound. And this, he held up his phone, is for talking to people who aren't here. Her eyes widened faintly. Communication without being close? Yeah, it's a phone call. He dialed his own number and handed it to her. When it rang and his other phone buzzed on the table, her eyes shot wide. It's reacting. James chuckled. That's how it works. She set the phone down carefully. Your kind is unusual. He laughed. You're one to talk. She placed the device aside. I'll adapt to this way of life. Good, he said, because I think you're sticking around for a while. Something flickered in her eyes. Uncertain, almost fragile. Yes, she murmured. Perhaps longer than I planned. James didn't push her on it, but he couldn't help wondering what she meant. Days passed, and Elena slowly adjusted to life in James's home. At first, Her presence was jarring, her intense stare, her silent steps, her complete ignorance of personal space. But James found himself growing accustomed to it. She no longer watched him sleep, at least he hoped not. She'd figured out the shower without breaking it and stopped eating eggshells. Small wins. Still, something about her remained a mystery. He first noticed it one night when he woke for a glass of water and saw a faint light under the bathroom door. Elena rarely used lights, claiming her kind saw better in the dark. Curious, he approached and found her standing before the mirror, her fingers brushing her collarbone as if searching for something. "Elena!" She stiffened but didn't turn. "You should be sleeping, James." "So should you." He leaned against the frame, watching her. "What are you doing?" After a long pause, she said, "My body feels different." He raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" She exhaled a rare sound. "I don't know." Stepping closer, he stood beside her in the mirror. She looked the same, tall, graceful, with that strange ethereal glow, but tension lined her posture, her emerald eyes unreadable. "Are you sick?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not sick. Changed." James frowned. "Maybe it's just this place. New planet, new air, new food. Your body's probably adjusting." "Perhaps," she said, unconvinced. "Look, if you need a doctor—" "No," she cut in sharply, turning to him. "I don't need help. I'll manage." Her tone was final, but James wasn't sold. Something was off, and he suspected she wasn't telling him everything. The next few days felt strange. Elena kept up her efforts to blend into human life, but James could sense a shift. She seemed weary, resting on the couch when she never had before. Her usual sharpness dulled, replaced by a quiet heaviness that hung over her like a shadow. She'd sit for long stretches, staring out the window at the gray sky, her hands resting lightly on her lap, as if she were listening to something far away. James watched her from the kitchen one afternoon, stirring a pot of soup he'd made, unsure whether to interrupt her silence. She'd always been so composed, so deliberate. Seeing her like this felt wrong, like a crack in a structure he'd assumed was unbreakable. He set the ladle down and approached her cautiously. "You've been quiet lately," he said, leaning against the armrest of the couch. Elena didn't turn her head, her emerald eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm adjusting," she replied, her voice low. James frowned. "To what exactly?" "You've been napping, zoning out. You're not yourself." She exhaled slowly, a sound he'd come to recognize as rare for her. "My body is recalibrating." He crossed his arms. "That's not an answer." "What's going on, Elena?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she shifted, her gaze finally meeting his. "I feel it more now. The presence inside me. It's growing stronger." His stomach tightened. "The thing you mentioned? The life?" She nodded, her fingers brushing her abdomen. "Yes, it's changing me." James swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. He'd been trying to wrap his head around her revelation since that night by the window, but it still felt like a dream or a nightmare. An alien woman, pregnant with his child. It defied everything he knew. "Okay," he said, forcing his voice steady. "How does it feel? Is it hurting you?" Elena tilted her head, considering. "Not pain. Not yet. But it's heavy, like it's pulling something from me." He sat beside her, keeping a small distance. "Pulling what?" "Energy," she said simply. "Life." James rubbed his face. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she admitted, and the honesty in her voice caught him off guard. She'd never been this open before. Over the next week, the changes became more noticeable. Elena's appetite surged. She'd raid the fridge at odd hours, piling plates with leftovers or tearing into bread straight from a loaf. One morning, James found her sitting at the table, a jar of peanut butter open in front of her, spoon in hand. He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't take you for a peanut butter fan." She glanced up mid-bite. "It satisfies a need." "Yeah, well, you're eating half my groceries," he said with a smirk, though he didn't mind. If anything, it was a relief to see her doing something so human. But her exhaustion grew, too. She'd collapse onto the couch after meals, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering shut. James started keeping a blanket nearby, draping it over her when she dozed off. She never thanked him, but she didn't protest either. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, James sat across from her in the living room, flipping through an old magazine he barely cared about. Elena was curled up under the blanket, her head resting on the armrest. The silence between them was comfortable, but heavy with unspoken questions. He set the magazine down. "Elena, we need to talk about this. Whatever's happening to you, it's not slowing down." She opened her eyes, slow and deliberate. "I know. So, what do we do? You can't just keep crashing on my couch and eating my food like it's normal. This is bigger than that." She sat up slightly, the blanket slipping off her shoulders. "What do you suggest?" James hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe we should figure out what this life, needs. If it's draining you, maybe there's a way to help." Elena studied him, her expression unreadable. "My kind doesn't have guides for this. We don't mix with others. This shouldn't even be possible." "But it is," he said firmly. "So, we deal with it. Together." She didn't reply right away, but something softened in her gaze. "You're not afraid," she said, almost like a question. James let out a dry laugh. "Oh, I'm terrified. But sitting around pretending it's not happening won't fix anything." She nodded slowly, as if his words were sinking in. "Very well. I'll try to understand it better. For both of us." The days blurred into a strange routine. James took to researching, scouring the internet for anything on alien biology, hybrid pregnancies, anything that might give them a clue. It was mostly nonsense, conspiracy blogs and sci-fi forums, but he kept at it, scribbling notes on a legal pad. Elena, meanwhile, began tracking her own changes. She'd sit with a notebook, jotting down sensations in a precise, almost clinical way. Increased hunger at dawn. Fatigue peaks midday. Pulse feels louder. James would read over her shoulder, asking questions she didn't always have answers for. "What's louder mean?" he'd say. "It's not like before," she'd reply, vague but certain. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, Elena woke James with a sharp gasp. He bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp. "What's wrong?" She stood by the bed, one hand pressed to her stomach, her face pale, even in the dim light. "It moved," she whispered. His heart raced. "Moved? Like you felt a kick?" She shook her head. "Not a kick. A shift. It's aware." James stared, his mouth dry. "Aware of what?" "Me," she said, then paused. "And you?" A chill ran through him. He slid out of bed, standing beside her. "What do you mean, me?" Elena took his hand and pressed it against her abdomen. At first, there was nothing, just the warmth of her skin. Then a faint pulse, not a heartbeat, but something deeper, rippled under his palm. He yanked his hand back, startled. "What the hell was that?" Her eyes locked onto his. "It knows you're here." James paced the room, his mind spinning. "Okay, so, it's not just growing, it's thinking? Feeling." Elena nodded. "It's more than I expected." He stopped, facing her. "Is that normal for your kind?" "No," she said flatly. "Our offspring don't connect like this. Not this early. Not like this." He rubbed his temples. "So, what is it?" "I don't know," she admitted, and the uncertainty in her voice sent a spike of worry through him. He took a breath. "All right, we'll figure it out. But you need a rest. Whatever this is, it's taking a lot out of you." She didn't argue, settling back into bed. James stayed awake, watching her, the weight of their situation sinking in deeper. Weeks passed and the connection grew. Elena described it in fragments, flashes of emotion, not words, but a presence that seemed to hum inside her. Sometimes she'd smile faintly, as if sharing a secret with it. Other times, she'd tense, her hands clenched, as if it overwhelmed her. James felt it too, in fleeting moments. When he touched her, a strange warmth would bloom in his chest, like an echo of something alive. It was unnerving, but it tethered them together in a way he couldn't explain. One crisp evening, they sat outside, the sky streaked with orange. Elena rested against the porch railing, her breathing slow. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that settled into your bones if you lingered too long, but neither of them seemed eager to move. James sat on the steps below, a steaming mug of tea cradled in his hands, watching the last light bleed into the horizon. Elena's presence beside him had become familiar, a constant in the chaos that had overtaken his once simple life. She shifted slightly, her hand resting on her abdomen, a gesture that had grown habitual over the weeks. The silence between them wasn't empty, it thrummed with the weight of everything unsaid. James glanced at her, the faint glow of her emerald eyes catching the fading sun. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice soft so as not to shatter the moment. Elena tilted her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "I'm listening." He raised an eyebrow. "To what?" She paused, her fingers pressing lightly against her stomach. "To it, the life inside me. It's loud now." James set his mug down on the step, turning to face her fully. "Louder how?" "Not sound," she clarified, her voice measured. "Awareness. It's reaching out." His chest tightened. The idea of something, someone inside her, conscious and connected, still sent a shiver through him. "Reaching out to you?" She nodded, then added, "And to you." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "That's a lot to take in." Elena's lips quirked, the ghost of a smile. "For me as well." James studied her for a moment. The way her posture had softened over time, the way her once rigid demeanor now carried a quiet vulnerability. "Does it scare you?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze drifting back to the sky. "My kind doesn't fear easily," she said at last. "But this is unknown. I don't know what it will become." James leaned back on his hands, the wood of the porch cool against his palms. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. Unknown doesn't always mean dangerous." She met his eyes again, searching. "You believe that?" He shrugged. "I have to. Otherwise, I'd lose my mind." The next morning, the air felt different, heavier, charged with something James couldn't name. Elena was already awake when he stumbled into the kitchen, her silhouette framed against the window as she stared at the misty fields beyond. "You're up early," he said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. She didn't turn. "I couldn't rest." He joined her, leaning against the counter. "Bad night." "Not bad," she said. "Strange. I felt it again, stronger this time. It's curious." James sipped his coffee, the warmth grounding him. "Curious about what?" "Everything," she replied, finally facing him. "Me. You. This place. It's like it's learning." He frowned. "Learning? It's not even born yet." Elena's hand drifted to her stomach. "My kind develops differently. Our minds awaken before our bodies are complete. But this is faster, more intense." James set his mug down, crossing his arms. "Okay, so it's smart already. What does that mean for us?" Elena hesitated, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't know. I've never known anything like it." He stepped closer, his voice firm. "Then we figured out. You're not doing this alone, Elena." She looked at him, her emerald eyes softening. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true," he said, holding her gaze. "Whatever this is, it's ours." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, a small gesture, but it carried a weight that settled deep in his chest. Over the following days, the bond grew tangible. Elena began describing sensations she couldn't fully explain, flashes of warmth, pulses of energy that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. She'd pause mid-sentence sometimes, her head tilting as if catching a whisper only she could hear. James noticed it too, in fleeting moments. When he stood near her, a strange hum would ripple through him, like a thread pulling taut between them. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, he tested it. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and the hum intensified, a quiet resonance that made his breath catch. Elena's eyes widened. "You feel it too," she said, not a question. He nodded, pulling his hand back. "Yeah, what is it?" "The child," she said simply. "It's linking us." That night, a storm rolled in, thunder rumbling in the distance. James found Elena standing by the back door, watching the rain lash the earth. Lightning illuminated her face in sharp bursts, casting shadows across her unearthly features. "You okay?" he asked, joining her. She didn't turn. It's restless. The storm? No, she said, her hand on her abdomen. The life inside me. It's reacting. James frowned, stepping closer. To the weather? To everything, she murmured. The sound, the energy. It's absorbing it. He watched her, the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers curled against her stomach. Is that normal? Nothing about this is normal, she said, her voice edged with something raw. He placed a hand on her back, tentative. Hey, we'll handle it. Whatever it needs, we'll give it. She leaned into his touch just slightly and nodded. The weeks stretched on, each day layering new strangeness onto their lives. Elena's body adapted at an alarming pace. Her skin took on a faint luminescence under certain lights. Her movements grew sharper, as if honed by some unseen force. James caught her one evening in the garage, staring at an old radio he'd been tinkering with. "What's up?" he asked, wiping grease from his hands. She didn't look away from the device. "It spoke to me." He blinked. "The radio?" "No," she said, turning to him. "The child. Through it." His stomach dropped. "What?" "I heard static," she explained, and then a pulse, like it was trying to understand the sound. James stared at the radio, then back at her. "So it's what hacking my stuff now?" Elena's lips twitched, almost a smile. "It's exploring." He laughed despite himself, the absurdity breaking through his unease. "Great. I've got a kid who's already smarter than me." Elena stepped closer, her hand finding his. "It's more than smart. It's alive in ways I can't predict." Her words hung between them, heavy but not hopeless. James squeezed her hand. "Then we'll learn with it, step by step." She nodded, and for the first time he saw a flicker of trust in her eyes, not just in him, but in whatever they were becoming. As time pressed forward, Elena's initial wariness faded into a quiet resolve. She began to embrace the life within her, speaking to it in soft murmurs when she thought James couldn't hear. He'd catch her in the yard, her voice low against the wind, her hands cradling her stomach. The child responded. She'd told him that much, its presence a steady hum that no longer startled her. James felt it too, a warmth that bloomed whenever he was near, a connection that defied explanation. They were a unit now, bound by something extraordinary. One evening, as frost dusted the windows, James sat beside her on the couch. He rested a hand on her stomach, no longer hesitant. The moment his palm touched her, a pulse rippled through him, strong, alive, undeniable. He grinned, meeting her gaze. "It's incredible." Elena nodded, her emerald eyes bright. "It's ours." The realization settled over them like a blanket, warm and certain. Months later, on a quiet morning filled with golden sunlight, Elena gave birth. The child, neither fully human nor fully alien, was beautiful, with traits from both its parents. Its eyes shimmered with the same emerald glow as Elena's, though softer, tempered by a warmth that mirrored James's steady presence. Its skin held a faint luminescence, a subtle echo of its mother's otherworldly origins, yet its tiny hands grasped with a strength that felt undeniably human. The delivery had been swift, almost too easy, as if the child had willed itself into the world. Elena lay on the bed, her breathing ragged but calm, cradling the newborn against her chest. James knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes locked on the small, impossible life they'd created. The room was still, save for the child's faint coos, a sound that seemed to resonate deeper than it should have. James brushed a damp strand of hair from Elena's forehead, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did it." She looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and wonder. "We did it." He smiled, a shaky, overwhelmed thing, and reached out to touch the child's cheek. The moment his fingers made contact, a pulse rippled through him, familiar now, after months of feeling it through Elena, but sharper, more real. The child's eyes flicked to his, wide and aware, and James felt his breath hitch. "It knows me," he said, half to himself. Elena nodded, her grip tightening slightly. "It's always known you." The first hours passed in a haze. James moved between awe and practicality, fetching water, adjusting pillows, watching Elena and the child with a protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. Elena, for her part, seemed transformed. The weariness that had plagued her for weeks lifted, replaced by a quiet strength. She held the baby with a reverence James hadn't seen in her before, her fingers tracing its features as if memorizing them. "What do we call it?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Elena tilted her head, considering. "My kind doesn't name offspring right away. We wait for a sign." James chuckled softly. "Well, I'm not waiting. How about something simple, like Leah?" Elena tested the sound, her lips curling faintly. "Leah, it fits." The days that followed were a delicate dance of discovery. Leah wasn't like any human infant James had ever encountered. She didn't cry, not in the usual way. Instead, she'd emit a low hum, a vibration that seemed to echo in the air, calming rather than distressing. Elena explained it was a trait of her species, a way to signal need without weakness. "She's strong," she said one afternoon, watching Leah grasp a spoon James had left on the table. He raised an eyebrow. "She's 3 days old and already stealing my stuff." Elena's laugh was soft, rare, and it warmed him more than the sunlight streaming through the window. But strength wasn't the only difference. Leah's awareness grew unervingly fast. By the end of the first week, her eyes followed them across the room, not with the vague curiosity of a newborn, but with intent. James caught her staring at him one night as he rocked her in his arms, her gaze piercing in a way that made his skin prickle. "She's thinking, isn't she?" he asked Elena, who sat nearby, folding a blanket. "Yes," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "Her mind is awake. It's how my kind survives." He shifted Leah's weight, meeting those glowing eyes. "And the human part? What's that doing?" Elena smiled faintly. "Making her stubborn, I think." The strangeness didn't end there. One evening, as James lit a fire in the living room, Leah, cradled in Elena's lap, reached toward the flames. The air shimmered briefly, and the fire flared brighter for a moment before settling. James froze, the poker still in his hand. "Did she just—" "Yes," Elena cut in, her voice steady but her eyes wide. "She influenced it." He set the poker down, heart racing. "Influenced it how?" "I don't know," she admitted, lifting Leah to study her. The child cooed, unbothered, as if she hadn't just bent the laws of nature. James ran a hand through his hair. "So she's got powers already? She's not even a month old." Elena's expression tightened. "This is beyond my kind, too. She's more." That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay beside Elena, listening to her even breathing and Leah's soft hum from the crib across the room. The implications gnawed at him. What would Leah become? A blend of human and alien, yes, but something else too. Something neither of them could predict. He slipped out of bed and stood by the crib, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. Her eyes opened, locking onto his, and that familiar pulse thrummed through him. "Hey, kid," he whispered, "you're gonna keep us on our toes, huh?" Leah's lips twitched, almost a smile, and James felt a surge of love, so fierce it nearly knocked him back. The weeks turned into a month, and Leah's presence reshaped their world. She grew faster than a human child should. By 6 weeks, she could sit up, her small hands reaching for everything within grasp. Elena taught her simple things, speaking in a language James didn't understand, a melodic string of sounds that made Leah's eyes light up. James, meanwhile, introduced her to human habits, singing off-key lullabies, showing her the texture of a wooden spoon, laughing when she mimicked his grin. Together, they built a fragile normalcy, a life stitched from 2 worlds. But questions lingered. One rainy afternoon, as Leah napped, James sat across from Elena at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling between his hands. "What happens when she's older?" he asked. Elena looked up from the cloth she was mending, her needle pausing. "What do you mean?" "She's not like us, not fully. What if she outgrows us?" Elena set the cloth down, her gaze steady. "She might, but she's ours. We'll guide her." He nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "And if she's too different? If the world notices?" Elena's jaw tightened. "We protect her, no matter what." That resolve was tested sooner than they expected. One evening, as James chopped wood outside, a strange hum filled the air, not Leah's, but something external. He dropped the axe and rushed inside. Elena stood by the window, Leah in her arms, her face pale. "What's that sound?" he demanded. "Them," she whispered. "My kind. They found me." His stomach dropped. "What do they want?" "Her," Elena said, clutching Leah tighter. The hum grew louder, and through the window, James saw shapes, shadowy figures in the dusk, their outlines wrong, too angular. Panic surged, but he forced it down. "They're not taking her," he said, grabbing a crowbar from the closet. Elena met his eyes, a flicker of gratitude in her fear. "Together?" "Always," he replied. The confrontation was brief but tense. Elena stepped outside, Leah shielded in her arms, while James flanked her, crowbar in hand. The figures, three of them tall and cloaked, spoke in that same melodic tongue. Elena answered, her voice sharp, unwavering. James didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. They wanted Leah. Elena refused. One figure advanced, and James swung the crowbar, a warning. "Back off," he growled. The figure paused, then retreated as Elena's tone rose, commanding. After a long, charged moment, they vanished into the night, the hum fading. James exhaled, adrenaline crashing. "They'll be back," Elena said, her voice low. "Maybe," he replied, pulling her close. "But we'll be ready." Life settled again, though the threat lingered like a distant storm. Leah remained their focus, her growth, her quiet power, her bond with him. Elena adapted, her fear giving way to a fierce maternal instinct. James stood by her, a pillar in the uncertainty, their partnership forged stronger by every challenge. Months later, on a quiet morning filled with golden sunlight, Elena gave birth. No, that moment had passed, but its echo lived in Leah, who now sat between them, a year old, her emerald eyes glowing faintly. She was beautiful with traits from both her parents, a testament to their union. As Elena cradled their child, a deep peace washed over her. She'd feared the unknown for so long, but now nothing else mattered. She wasn't alone. She had James. She had their child. For the first time, she felt truly at home. James sat beside her, an arm around her shoulders, gazing at Leah, then Elena. He smiled. "You were right about one thing." She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He kissed her forehead. "This child is something entirely new." She leaned into him, exhaling softly. "Yes, and I think they'll change everything." James chuckled. "Then let's make sure it's for the better." Elena smiled, resting her head against his. Together, their child cooed gently, as if in agreement, and a new chapter began, one of love, hope, and infinite possibilities.